Usually when we talk about geopolitical forecasting, there's this expectation of like precision.
Right. It's supposed to feel measurable.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like meteorology or something. You look at the satellite imagery, you track the pressure systems, and the analysts just point at the map and say, there's the hurricane. It's going to make landfall right there.
Comfortingly predicted, right. Track the military buildups, monitor diplomatic summits, and it all just sort of fits into neat little categorizable boxes.
Right. But then you look at the events of early 2026, and suddenly that weather map is just completely useless. I mean, we are looking at a geopolitical landscape that is entirely unprecedented.
Oh, absolutely.
You've got a massive nationwide uprising sweeping across Iran. You've got an internet blackout lasting over 53 days.
Which is the longest nationwide digital shutdown on human record, by the way.
Right. And of course, the devastating U.S. and Israeli military strike that resulted in the death of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Yeah. It is the absolute definition of uncharted territory. What the intelligence and the ground reports from 2026 show us isn't just, a passing storm. It's a fundamental tectonic shift in the region's foundation.
Which brings us perfectly to today's deep dive into the source material you shared with us. And this one is custom tailored directly for you, the listener, because we aren't just going to look at the explosive external geopolitics of this conflict. We are opening up the hood to look at the internal engine of change.
Exactly.
Our mission today is to understand the critical influence of domestic groups on a potential shift toward democracy in Iran following the chaos of 2026.
And, to really understand that engine, we need to establish the ground rules for how we're actually examining this incredibly dense material.
Oh, yeah, a vital point. So before we dive into the deep end, just a quick note on the documents we're unpacking today. These sources contain incredibly raw and highly charged political content.
Very charged.
Right. We're talking about explosive international conflicts, controversial U.S. and Israeli military actions, the brutal realities of the Iranian regime, and deeply passionate, often conflicting viewpoints from, left-wing organizers, right-wing factions, monarchists, separatist groups. So our job today isn't to take a side.
No, not at all.
And we certainly aren't endorsing the viewpoints of any of these political factions, nations, or the original authors. We are here purely as analysts, impartially reporting on the ideas and events contained in the provided source material, simply to help you understand what is unfolding.
And that context is everything. Because, setting the stage based on those sources, we first need to recognize that the Islamic Republic isn't just dealing with, another wave of street protests.
Right.
They are facing what the documents explicitly term a structural crisis. So the unwritten social contract, the arrangement where an authoritarian state provides basic material welfare, subsidies, security in exchange for the population's political passivity.
Right, the basic trade-off.
Yeah, that trade-off has completely dissolved.
Okay, let's unpack this. So the overarching crisis starts with the fact that the state can basically no longer uphold its end of the bargain. And historically, revolutions don't start just because people want abstract freedom, right? They spark when people simply cannot afford to feed their families.
Exactly. If we trace the causality in the reports, the trigger was a total catastrophic economic collapse. So in late December 2025, the Iranian rial plummeted to a staggering record low.
How low are we talking?
1.4 million per US dollar.
Wait, 1.4 million to 1?
Yeah. That isn't just inflation, that is an absolute free fall.
I can't even wrap my head around that kind of hyperinflation. That means life savings are wiped out in an afternoon. Purchasing power just drops to zero.
It completely obliterates the middle class overnight. And this specific economic devastation, it sparked a massive strike by the bazaris.
Ah, the merchant class.
Right. The traditional merchants operating out of these massive hubs like Tehran's Grand Bazaar, specifically the Aladdin Shopping Center and Sharsu Mall. And the thing to remember is the traditional merchant class was actually a foundational pillar of the original 1979 Islamic Revolution.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they were the financial backers of the clerics. But now, facing wholesale bankruptcy, that foundational pillar has completely fractured.
But the sources highlight that it isn't just the shopkeepers turning off the lights, right? The real heavyweight shift comes with the entry of organized labor, specifically in the oil, gas, and petrochemical sectors. I was reading about this initiative in the documents called the 14.1 Torn Campaign.
Yeah, the 14.1 Foreign Campaign, it represents this highly sophisticated mobilization of over 21,000 project workers.
Wow.
And they're spread across 92 different companies.
Mm-hmm.
And the name actually comes from their central demand. They wanted 14 days of grueling, continuous labor on the rigs or in the refineries, followed by a mandatory 14 days off so they could actually return home and see their families.
So they are pushing back against punishing schedules and corrupt employment agencies.
They are, yeah. But it quickly escalated beyond just the oil sector. The Syndicate of Tehran bus workers and the Haftaka sugarcane union, they joined the fray too. So by launching strikes in vital economic hubs like Asaluya and Bandar Abbas, these organized labor groups are basically acting as the structural anchor for a potential democratic republic. They're systematically cutting off the state's primary revenue streams.
I want to look at the motivation there, though, because labor isn't just the engine of a state, they are the fuel line.
Right.
The regime needs billions to fund the security forces operating in the streets. If the oil workers strike, that fuel line is cut and the security apparatus goes bankrupt. But, and this is the question, are these workers striking to build a democracy, or are they just desperate people demanding a livable paycheck?
Well, the sources emphasize a massive qualitative shift in 2026. This is no longer just a dispute over unpaid wages or shift schedules. These workers are now explicitly linking their economic survival to the overthrow of what their manifestos term the, quote, theocratic capitalist dictatorship.
Oh, so they are naming it directly.
Directly. They've recognized that a fractured, sanctioned, and corrupt political framework simply cannot solve their economic grievances. The strike is now inherently political. Its goal is to paralyze the state.
Okay, so if labor is cutting the fuel line, there is an entirely different demographic actively dismantling the ideological engine of the regime.
Yes.
We are looking at a transition from basic economic survival to a full-blown cultural revolution, driven by the youth and by women.
Right. The demographic core of this cultural vanguard is Generation Z. What the data shows us in 2026 is an intense evolution of the 2022 woman life freedom protests.
Right, which were sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini in morality police custody.
Exactly. By 2026, the sources indicate this movement has escalated into what locals are calling a national revolution.
And the staggering courage required to do this on a daily basis, I mean, it's hard to process. Women are engaging in literal street battles for bodily autonomy. They are demanding a complete end to gender apartheid. And the human cost documented in these reports is just horrific. The sources note over 236 minor deaths and more than 259 women killed during these crackdowns.
Yeah, it's devastating. And despite that lethal response from the security forces, the resistance has become deeply entrenched. Universities have basically transformed into ground zero for this ideological battle.
Right.
Students are systematically boycotting classes and exams. Officially, they frame it as mourning for those killed, but functionally, it's a coordinated strike.
Like a sit-in?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the regime's response is often to just shut down these educational institutions entirely. They're desperately trying to break up the physical spaces where young people gather, debate, and organize.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because if the state is shutting down the universities to stop physical gatherings, I imagine their next target is the one place youth actually organize, which is their phones.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources detail a 53-day nationwide internet blackout. The regime essentially turned off the digital world for nearly 2 months at an estimated cost of $1.8 billion to their own economy. Online sales dropped by 80%. So my question is, how does a secular youth movement organize a national revolution if the internet is quite literally unplugged?
That brings us to one of the most fascinating mechanisms of the uprising, which is technological circumvention. It is a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. When the state attempted to impose what they call the barracks internet.
Barracks internet.
Yeah, it's a domestic internet completely cut off from the global web. But the youth adapted immediately. The U.S. covertly smuggled thousands of Starlink satellite terminals across the borders.
But wait, you can't just mount a Starlink dish on your balcony in Tehran without the IRGC noticing, right?
No, definitely not. And that's where the ingenuity really shines. When the regime deployed jammers or went door-to-door confiscating the dishes, activists turned to satellite TV hacks. Yeah. They literally hijacked the signals of state-run television networks to broadcast opposition messages directly into millions of living rooms. They relied on decentralized digital platforms, mesh networks, and rotating proxy applications to keep the communication lines open.
Wow.
It just demonstrates the sheer resilience of culturally secularized youth that flat out refuses to be silenced.
So we have this highly urban, technologically savvy resistance in Tehran and the major cities. But looking at the broader map, the true test of Iran's democratic future seems to lie in its borderlands. We need to talk about the geographic depth of this movement, specifically regarding the ethnic and religious minorities.
Yeah, the structural data points heavily toward the borderlands. The sources detail this concept of the double minority burden. We're looking at populations like the Kurds in the west, the Baluchis in the southeast, and the Arabs in the southwest.
And double minority means they are marginalized on two fronts, right? They are non-Persian ethnically and non-Shia religiously.
Correct. The Iranian state historically defines its core identity through the Persian language and Shia Islam. So, because these groups fall outside both of those categories, they face the absolute harshest crackdowns. The reports document that ethnic minorities make up a vastly disproportionate number of the political executions, disappearances, and detentions.
And yet they are organizing with incredible sophistication. I mean, the sources highlight how Kurdish opposition groups, specifically the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, or KDPI, alongside Komala, and the East Kurdistan Women's Platform, known as Jina Trina, they held joint conferences in early 2026.
Yes.
They are coordinating general strikes that encompass entire provinces, and their primary demand is a decentralized, federalized democracy.
Which represents a fundamental reimagining of how the Iranian state has operated for centuries.
Yeah, I think of the traditional Iranian power structure like a tightly clenched fist. All the authority, all the oil revenue, all the military power is tightly controlled by the center, by Tehran. What these minority groups are demanding is an open hand, a system where all the fingers have equal strength and agency.
That's a great way to put it.
Because they aren't asking to break Iran apart into separate independent nations, right, say. They want local control over their own regional economies, the right to teach in their native languages, and cultural autonomy, all within the borders of a unified, democratic Iran.
The open hand analogy captures the demand perfectly.
Yeah.
And the sources make a really critical assertion here. Without this geographic depth, without the organizational experience, the cross-border smuggling networks, and the fierce resistance of these minority groups, a successful democratic transition is practically mathematically impossible. You cannot build a stable, representative Iran while systematically excluding nearly half of its diverse population.
Right. So labor is cutting the funds, Gen Z is hacking the communications, minorities are organizing for a federal system. But how is the elite establishment reacting to this multi-front assault, especially in the chaotic aftermath of the U.S. and Israeli military strikes that actually killed Supreme Leader Khamenei?
Well, this creates a highly volatile power vacuum at the very top. The sources describe severe fracturing within the regime's elite. With Khamenei dead, alongside key legacy security figures like Ali Larijani, the traditional clerical hierarchy is completely paralyzed. We were seeing political moderates, like President Pezeshkian, being sidelined. Power is rapidly bleeding away from the religious clerics and flowing directly toward the military apparatus.
Which introduces the terrifying possibility detailed in these documents, the Pakistan model.
Yes, the Pakistan model suggests that instead of a democratic transition, or even a total systemic collapse, the Iranian state might evolve into a military-dominated junta run entirely by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
Hold on, I have to push back here, because if I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, wait, if the IRGC military apparatus takes over and just props up a figurehead, isn't that just replacing a religious dictator with a military dictator? How does that model even work, and why is it a threat?
It is the single greatest threat to the democratic movement, actually. And it proves that regime collapse does not automatically equal a democracy. The Pakistan model refers to a system where the military controls all foreign policy, nuclear development, and major economic sectors. But they use a civilian, or in this case a clerical facade, to absorb all the domestic anger.
Oh, I see.
The sources suggest the IRGC could use Mojtaba Khamenei, the late supreme leader's son, as a convenient puppet to maintain a thin veneer of continuity.
So the IRGC drops the strict religious ideology when it's no longer useful, and they just rule purely through coercion and national security paranoia.
Exactly that. Wars inherently elevate coercive institutions. The IRGC is the only body equipped to ensure the regime's survival through sheer unfiltered force. They could create a hyper-militarized state focused solely on survival, abandoning the religious pretense entirely.
Which makes this final piece of the puzzle so urgent. If the regime is teetering, or if the IRGC is actively trying to permanently lock down the country into a military junta who is actually ready to step up and lead a democratic transition, we really have to examine the opposition architecture.
And what the sources reveal is an opposition that is passionately committed, but highly fractured, both on the streets of Iran and in the global diaspora.
Right.
On one side of the ideological spectrum, you have monarchist factions rallying behind the exiled crown prince, Reza Pahlavi.
The son of the last Shah, who was overthrown in 1979.
Yes, and his proposition is to establish a secular transitional government that would stabilize the country and eventually hold a national referendum, allowing Iranians to formally choose their preferred system of government. And the reports actually note that during the 2026 protests, his name was chanted by demonstrators who were just desperate for a recognized, internationally palatable leader.
But he is far from the only option. The sources also analyze the National Council of Resistance of Iran, the NCRI, led by Maryam Rajavi.
Right.
And they have articulated a very specific 10-point plan for a democratic republic. It explicitly calls for gender equality, the abolition of the death penalty, and the complete dismantling of Iran's nuclear program.
Right. And in an attempt to bridge these massive ideological chasms, we see initiatives like the Iran Freedom Congress, recently convened in London. Their objective isn't to anoint a single leader, but to construct a pluralistic umbrella movement. They're trying to get Marxists, staunch Republicans, right-wing nationalists, and centrists all into the same room.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, exactly. But the goal is to build a cohesive framework to support the democratic forces actually operating on the ground inside Iran.
The tension there has to be incredible, though. The sources point out that many leftist groups and independent labor unions inside Iran vehemently reject the idea of returning to a monarchy. They view the Pahlavi dynasty as representative of a deeply authoritarian past. I mean, they haven't forgotten that the Shah's secret police, Savak, brutally crushed political dissent before 1979.
No, they certainly haven't.
Yet you have other protesters shouting his name just to present a unified front to the international community.
The discord is profound. You have deeply entrenched groups, completely at odds ideologically, united for this brief window in time solely by their desire to overthrow the current system.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this deep dive? It means that the success of Iranian democracy hinges entirely on a ticking clock. Can these highly fractured groups, the striking oil workers sweating in Bandar Abbas, the Gen Z women hacking satellite feeds in Tehran, the Kurdish activists demanding an open hand in the West, and the exiled politicians arguing in London, can they forge a shared, actionable vision?
Right.
And can they do it before the IRGC's military apparatus locks the country down permanently into a security dictatorship?
That is the defining race of the post-2026 landscape. Synthesizing the intelligence across all these sources, we are ultimately looking at three possible outcomes. First, the military security dictatorship, the Pakistan scenario we talked about where the IRGC seizes total control behind a puppet leader.
Okay.
Second, a systemic collapse triggered by the sheer weight of those national labor strikes, a sort of Gorbachev moment where the central authority simply disintegrates because the checks bounce. Or third, negotiated federal transition that successfully integrates the democratic demands of the ethnic minority groups and the secular youth.
It is, above all, an incredible testament to human resilience. From the petrochemical workers risking execution to starve the state, to the schoolgirls refusing the hijab in the face of gunfire, to the Baluchi activists organizing general strikes. The push for democracy is bleeding up from the ground. They are simultaneously fighting a brutal domestic crackdown, navigating a totally shattered economy, and surviving the chaos of foreign military intervention.
Absolutely. The agency in this conflict ultimately belongs to the Iranian people. They are no longer asking for incremental reform.
Yeah.
The sources make it unequivocally clear they are demanding a fundamental transformation of their society.
I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, something that builds on everything we've explored today about the internal engine of Iran. We've talked deeply about how these domestic groups, labor, youth, minorities, could systematically dismantle the regime and build a peaceful federal democracy. But consider the ripple effect. If they actually succeed, what happens beyond Iran's borders? Think about Iran's vast network of regional proxies, groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen.
Right, they rely entirely on Iran.
Exactly. These organizations rely almost entirely on the IRGC's funding, training, and weapons. If the Iranian labor unions and the youth successfully cut off the regime's money to build a democracy at home, the entire geopolitical map of the Middle East could be fundamentally redrawn overnight. Suddenly, that unpredictable weather map we talked about at the very beginning, it doesn't just show a storm clearing over Tehran, it shows the climate changing for the entire globe. It's definitely something to keep an eye on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources, and we wish you well on your continued learning journey.